Renaissance students, I miss you. And I'm going to walk you through a few details about chapters 2 through 5 of Their Eyes Were Watching God, some things I would point out if we were together in class. And first, I'm going to make a couple of more general comments. This book was really well received when it first came out. And we've talked about how the Harlem Renaissance artists and writers had differing views of the role of art, whether art by black artists needs to concentrate on issues of race or oppression or difficulty, and whether it should show negative sides of the black community. And one of the things that became a little bit controversial or had mixed responses about this book was, as you'll see, the book deals almost entirely just with the black community that Janie is in. And it also shows some black characters in a not great light. And Richard Wright, who became one of the most prominent writers of the Chicago Black Renaissance, a decade or so after this book was written, he was already a somewhat prominent writer when this book came out, and he was highly critical of it. He thought that black art really ought to be directly, in a political way, addressing racism and oppression, and he felt that this was just a sort of silly love story. So that sort of ushered in a period of time where this book did not get very much honored. Like I said, when it first came out, it was pretty positively received. Langston Hughes, who's one of the most well-known writers of the Harlem Renaissance, was a good friend and a collaborator with Zora Neale Hurston. They collaborated on some other projects. And again, many black writers and artists did receive it positively when it first came out, and then its reputation sort of diminished. And then it became virtually unknown, as did Zora Neale Hurston, until about the 1970s. And Hurston herself died fairly poor after ending up working as a maid for a while. So the reception of the book was related to some of these themes of the Harlem Renaissance. What's the role and the purpose of black artists? And although Richard Wright criticized this book for not directly addressing racism and oppression, I would encourage you to notice the places where that is in evidence, particularly things like we hear Nanny's story about surviving slavery. There are subtle ways that racial inequality comes into play. Like, for example, the way some of the residents of Eatontown, where Joe Starks takes Janie, feel they don't like him because Sam Waters says at one point it feels like he's got a switch in his hand when he's talking to you. They seem to suggest they feel like he is trying to act like some sort of white owner over them. Joe also assumes that there must be some sort of authority, someone in power, whereas before he arrives, the black residents there are just content to live in an equal community. So there are subtle ways that racial differences do come into play. There's also, of course, a couple of you are interested in the phenomenon of colorism. And when Nanny tells the story of the birth of Janie's mother, we see that it's revealed to Nanny's owner's wife that the child is the child of Nanny's owner by the color of her skin. And Nanny initially tries to hide the baby from her. So that oppression is evident. It was not evident enough for the taste of someone like Richard Wright. And it is a distinct book because it really explores this individual character, Janie, and her desire for love and her search for love. So people have differing views about whether it addresses race, and if it does or doesn't, does that matter in terms of her success and her responsibilities as a black writer? So that's something to keep in mind, something some of you might decide you want to explore in a paper. I also want to point out a couple of details about the text, including in relation to some motifs. And a motif is a type of image or a type of thing or object that is repeatedly mentioned in a text, and that usually ends up having some thematic significance. It represents something larger about the characters. So I'll mention a few of them over the course of a couple or three videos, but two I want to mention today are hair and clothing. And Sam, I think it was, asked about hair, like when Janie gets to Eatonville and Joe has his store and Joe makes her cover up her hair. Why does he do that? Well, a lot of you have probably sort of figured out, oh, it has to do with him controlling her. It has to do with hiding her physical beauty from the other men in the town. But hair is mentioned repeatedly, and notice even in the first chapter, when Janie comes back to town after being away, they notice that braid hanging down her back. So for some of you that decide you might want to write a paper on this book, just picking a motif and tracing where it comes up, what's important about it. So hair and clothing, notice also things like when Janie leaves Logan Killick's and goes off with Joe Stark, she throws her apron away from her. So there are ways that hair and clothing become a motif. And another really prominent and important motif is trees. So I'm going to go through just in page order some of the details that I would be pointing out to you if we were talking about it in class. So this won't be quite in order of those motifs or issues, but I'll point out a few examples just to give you an idea and draw your attention to a few details. And first, at the very beginning of chapter 2, so I'm going to be reading my book here off screen, so sorry, I'll be looking away. At the very beginning of chapter 2, we see Janie saw her life like a great tree in leaf, with things suffered, things enjoyed, things done and undone. Dawn and doom were in its branches. So it's introduced right there. It's going to come up again and again and again. I also want to point out, at the beginning of chapter 2, we get a long stretch of time. Again, Janie is telling her story to Phoebe. And for the first couple of pages, it's in Janie's voice with that dialect, with the words spelled the way they would be pronounced. And that can be a little tricky to read. And there's lots of dialogue written in dialect. And you just kind of have to develop an ear for it. You might try and read it out loud to yourself to get the feel of the sound of it. But Hurston knew that writing an entire book in that kind of dialect would be pretty tricky. So notice on page 10, there's a shift over from Janie's first-person narration to third-person narration. Janie is talking up through this point, and then we get this interruption, and we see Phoebe's hungry listening helped Janie to tell her story. And so she went on thinking back to her younger years. Then it switches over into a third-person narration where the language is more like typical written English. Now, again, that dialect comes back in a lot, but Hurston makes that shift there. It's also an interesting point about who's telling whose story. And if any of you decide you want to read the afterword of this book by the scholar Henry Louis Gates, he really dives into the complexities of who's telling the story here and who's in charge of each individual story. I want to point out again, I'm just going to now go in page order because I've got all these things marked and highlighted in my book. So I'll skip around a bit in terms of the motifs. But again, we see right early there on pages 10 and 11, in chapter 2, the importance of the tree. Janie sees her life like a pear tree. And you've all heard references to the idea of the birds and the bees. Being away, parents tell children about sex and sexuality. Well, very clearly, Hurston's using it that way. The pear tree is in relation to her sort of sexual awakening, her desire to go and kiss Johnny who comes down the street. And we can certainly see on page 11 the description of the blossom of the pear tree that very much has sort of sexual connotations. She was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun, and the panting breath of the breeze. When the inaudible voice of it all came to her, she saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom. The 1,000 sister calyxes arch to meet the love embrace, and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was a marriage. And of course, that's not at all what her first marriage is like. But the sexual connotations to the description are strong. And that's one way tree is used. Tree is used in other ways as well. Later on that page, oh, to be a pear tree, any tree in bloom, Janie wants and desires so much. Notice also, Nanny herself looks like a tree when Janie goes inside. Nanny's been laying down with a headache, and as a sort of folk remedy, they've tied some leaves around her head. So we've got these big leaves hanging down on her face, and her older person, wrinkly, dark skin, so she looks like a tree. So that's another place where the tree comes in. And you can notice then, of course, once she's sort of married off to Logan Killick's and she goes to Logan Killick's yard, there's a big stump in the yard. So that's some indication of Logan Killick's relationship to Janie's desired tree. I mentioned already some of Nanny's origin story, or Nanny's birth of Janie's grandmother, or Janie's mother. Remember, Janie's mother's name is Leafy. So again, we get lots and lots of tree references. Again, lots of hair references, lots of animal references. That's a motif that's going to come up again. You know, Nanny tells Janie that black women are the mule of the world. There's other places where Janie is referred to as an animal. We'll see the treatment of animals become very important in some later chapters as well. I'm sorry, I'm going to just go through and point out a couple of other places where we see these motifs being important. Again, in Logan's yard, there's a stump, whereas Janie is looking for the pear tree. We see Joe Starks come. Many of you have jumped in and started to respond to the forum questions about Janie and Nanny and Logan and Joe. So I hope you'll do that. Another sort of theme, of course, in the novel is Janie's identity. And remember that story she tells early about she didn't even know she was black until she saw a photograph of herself. That plays into this theme that we know ourselves when we are looking at ourselves from another perspective, when we're telling a story, when we have a listener for our story, or when we can become a viewer of our own story. And of course, when Janie learns that she's black by looking at the photograph, she's disappointed. Another sort of theme in the book that's related there is this is why Nanny decides she better buy some land and move her off of the property of the white family. Because Janie doesn't have that sense of identity of being black, and also because the black kids at the school have been mocking and making fun of Janie for wearing hand-me-down white people's clothes. So that sense of where does she fit in? Now, some of you might decide you want to write a paper comparing something about Janie with something about one of the characters in passing, because that idea of what is the black identity, where does that come into play, is crucial here. And of course, Janie doesn't even know her name. People had so many names for her that they just call her Alphabet, and even Logan Killick calls her Little Bit for Alphabet. So those are a couple of other motifs to keep an eye out for as you finish reading the novel. Notice when they come up. I'm going to see if there's some other passages I had marked that I would be pointing out to you. Some of you are starting to comment on Logan Killick and what he's like, and you know, he's a little bit of a complex character. We don't learn about him too much, but we see that he is in fact hurt by the way Janie speaks to him and talks to him. I want to point out again when Janie decides to run off with Joe Starks, and you're going to comment on the forum. What do you think about that decision? When they arrive there in Eatonville, he just assumes that people have to have someone to tell them what to do. Who's your mayor? Who's telling you what to do? Who's in charge? So I'm wanting to make sure. Yes, on page 39, I made a quick reference earlier to the other residents of Eatonville and how they respond to Joe Starks. They love what he does for the town. He gets a store going. He gets a post office. But on the top of page 39, we can see Hicks and the other friend there talking about him. And they say, us talks about the white man keeping us down. Shucks, he don't have to. Us keeps our own selves down. And when they're debating, you know, have they been keeping themselves down? Or then also, is Joe Starks in any way keeping them down by treating them as less than himself? I apologize for the ums. It's very odd to be recording myself. And the idea again of who's telling whose story and who's speaking, of course, is very important. And we see one of those first places where there's some cracks in what Janie thought she was getting with Joe when he makes the big speech when he opens the store. And of course, he specifically says, no, Janie doesn't have anything to say. So is she silenced? And where throughout the novel is Janie silenced? So I've been talking for almost 15 minutes straight. That's probably more than you want to listen to at one time. I'll try and do another one or two of these for other sections of the book. Do please post on the forum or email me if you have questions you would like me to address directly, either there in text or here on YouTube in a video. And I hope you're all doing okay and sheltering in place and staying healthy. And I will talk to you again soon.